be recording this call, and if you sign up to our newsletter, you'll be able to get the recording. So Shadaab, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here, Sharmeen.
No doubt. So tell me about yourself. How did you come to Qur'an of the Oppressed? What inspired you?
Well, it was actually anger that inspired me, discomfort. And it was anger and discomfort with a dichotomy that has been constructed and continuously reconstructed in our world of religion and Islam on the one hand, and the struggle for social justice and human rights on the other, as if these two are mutually exclusive categories at best, and at worst, the representation, or I would say misrepresentation, of religion as a fundamental stumbling block in the path towards liberation. And so this dichotomy of either or, Islam or human rights, Islam or social justice, that is what inspired me to write this book, which seeks to undermine fundamentally that dichotomy by showing how Muslims in the contemporary world are undertaking liberative readings of the Qur'an and speaking to their own lived contexts of oppression. And for myself, in terms of my own upbringing, this project was particularly important because I had a very religious upbringing. I grew up in the mosque. I'm a Canadian of Indian descent, and I grew up in Vancouver / Coast Salish territories. And as I said, I grew up in the mosque. I'm a Sufi, so my dad is a Shia, my mom is a Sunni, and I had the opportunity and blessing of growing up in both communities. And it was a very enriching experience. I was deeply connected to the ritual practice of Islam, and it meant a lot to me. And that was an important part of who I was, but it wasn't the only part of who I was. I was also someone who cared deeply about justice and liberation struggles outside of the mosque setting. I cared deeply about workers' rights, about supporting the Palestinian liberation struggle, about solidarity work in the wider non-Muslim community. And so this book is really about bridging these two different parts of myself, the religious part and the progressive part, by bringing it together through liberation theology. And liberation theology gave me the language to crush that dichotomy and to think beyond it.
I really appreciate that. Just this weekend, we saw on Twitter, a white commentator on political things was like, oh, there's no such thing as the religious left. And, you know, like Muslims, Black folks across the country were like, what do you mean, right? Like religious communities have been organizing against oppression for decades, right? So tell me, what is Islamic liberation theology?
Well, at its core, it's about raising the who question. So when we engage religion, whose religion are we engaging? I am not of the opinion that religious belief and practice are neutral. Religion does not fall out of the sky. Religion is mediated by society. And the harsh reality of the matter is that our society is not equal. What that means is that religion is generally mediated by the privileged center of our society. And that can mean different things in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, and so forth. And so what we see is not religion per se, but religion according to the reading of the center. And because that center is so privileged, that reading becomes privileged and it gains an aura of neutrality. And so liberation theology is saying, well, who is mediating religion here? Whose lived experiences get to become the context through which we understand and practice faith? Liberation theology is about shifting the mediator, the interpreters of religion, from the center to the margins of society. So in a nutshell, it's a twofold act. One of deconstructing a religion of the center, a religion of establishment, and then by including marginalized groups into the interpretive circle, reproducing religious understanding in the light of new and hitherto ignored lived experiences of injustice. So in a nutshell, that's what liberation theology is all about.
Yeah, and that I think that framing helps us so much because in America right now, we're seeing a battle against centrism, right? We're seeing the democratic establishment moving more towards the center and working alongside super conservative austerity measure agendas, you know? And I think what centrism does, it doesn't allow us to think about liberation as the end goal. It allows us to think of the small fruits on the way, whereas people who are on the margins need freedom now. We need food now, right? So in your book, you speak extensively about the importance of praxis, and praxis as a methodology to explore what is accommodationist theology. So can you tell me more about these terms and how do you explore them?
Okay, so let me start with praxis. And I have a tendency to forget when I say, let me do this first, and I forget the second thing. So please remind me, Shadmin, what the second thing is. So let me start with praxis. When we talk about praxis in liberation theology, we're not just referring to practice. We're referring to a particular form of practice, and that is a liberative practice. You can have practices that are accommodationist. You can have practices that are complicit in suffering. But liberationist practice is about being part of a struggle to transform society from a state of injustice to justice. Now, in liberation theology, practice is not just a theme. It is fundamental to the methodology of liberation. The framing is very important. It is not theology of liberation. It is liberation theology. So liberation comes first. And theology, as important as it is, as central as it is to people of faith like myself, is actually the second act. So we begin with the text of life, our lived experiences. And then once we understand that and we situate ourselves in a liberative struggle within that context, we then engage our scriptures and we understand our scriptures the way they were meant to be understood. And that is not in an abstracted sense. That is in the concrete realities of our immediate problems.
Right. Yeah. And when you are critiquing accommodationist theology, like what are you critiquing?
Okay, great question. Let me start by answering what is accommodationist theology. So in a nutshell, an accommodationist theology is a theology that accommodates the unjust status quo. That theology, the key thing to understand is that it is the foil of liberation theology, but these are not two equal theologies. It's not like I have liberation theology on one hand and accommodation theology on the other. It's more like a vertical orientation. So from below, from the margins, with the margins, for the margins, we have a liberation theology emerging, but on the top, we have accommodation theology. That is the dominant hegemonic theology. And this is a key point. Because it is the dominant theology, it gets to drop the accommodation part of accommodation theology. It becomes theology with an uppercase T. And that is a very scary thing. So by calling it accommodation theology, that this is not some neutral theology, this is a partisan theology, that is already part of the liberative struggle, to name it and therefore to see it for what it actually is. Now, in terms of accommodationist theologies, we have different examples. I think two really powerful ones are the Dutch Reformed Church and its complicity in South African apartheid. And a very important historical one is the complicity of the Catholic Church with the Spanish crown during the conquest of South America in the 15th and 16th centuries, okay? But a takeaway that I really want you to take away here is that an accommodationist theology is not just about accommodationist institutions.
Right.
It is about accommodationist ideas. So in the context of the United States, the idea of Jesus, who is my beloved prophet as a Muslim, Jesus as being a white person, as being blonde-haired and blue-eyed, that means something in the context of the United States as a white supremacist state, built on the blood of African Americans through the institution of slavery. That means something. That is a theology that has been contested for over 50 years now. That is a theology that is playing a very clear political role in legitimating and therefore sustaining an incredibly unjust structure. So when we talk about accommodationist theology, we're not just talking about institutions, but also ideas.
Yeah, yeah, and I think for a lot of queer Muslims or Muslims that have been on the margins, whether you're Shia, whether you're Ahmadi, you know, the accommodation of, for example, the Saudi Arabian state and the way that the Saudi Arabian state has perpetuated harm upon minority communities. And, you know, we don't have to go into the details of the labor market, right? Of how Pakistani, Bangladeshi laborers are treated within the UAE and Dubai and the what we see as the Muslim world, but we know that that's a very false narrative of like who is holding liberation theology as an important value and who is using Islam as a political tool to subjugate and oppress bodies, right? And so somebody asked in the chat, can you explain more about praxis? The word feels jargony, right? Like when we say praxis, when we say we are trying to practice and reflect on a different way of being, what does that really mean to you?
Okay, that's a great question. Let's let go of the term praxis, because I am an academic, but I come from a non-academic background and I find it very alienating. Let's just use the term practice, all right? Now, what does it mean in the context of liberation theology? It means that our lived experiences are holy and that they matter, all right? They matter. What it means is that when you go through an experience of oppression, when you are dehumanized, when you are robbed of your human dignity, you have an authority given to you, an authority that knows your own contexts, and therefore that you have the ability to read the text in a way that can actually be relevant to you and for you and your community, in a way that others can't read it for you. So that's really what it means, that context is in fact a holy text. It does not belittle scriptural texts. I care deeply about the Qur'an. In the month of Ramadan, I read a juz'ah, a 1/30th part each night to finish the whole Qur'an in the whole month. I care deeply about my text. But my text cares deeply about my text, and that is the text of my life. And that is why the Qur'an came, to be a huda, a guidance to those who are living in this life and who are struggling in this life. And so that's what praxis means, that this is in fact how scripture is meant to be engaged, through the lived experiences of the ones who are reading it.
I love that reframe. I think there is this like fear of people that haven't studied at Al-Azhar University or haven't went through, you know, Islamic school for 20 years to become people that are engaging with the text critically, and that fear of not being smart enough. But we see that there are so many ways that Muslims around us, or those who are Sunni Muslims, like perpetuate harm or hurt us through their analysis sometimes. Like just this weekend on Twitter, multiple Ahmadiyya Muslims were trolled and attacked by Sunni Muslims that were saying, you are not Muslim. During the holy month of Ramadan, Sunni Muslims are mobilizing to attack and troll Ahmadiyyas. And I think what that really brings up for me is, what is the practice that we are bringing forth with some of our beliefs and our ideas around who is Islam for, what is this religion supposed to bring to our communities, right? And how do we engage with those critical questions of reflection on how we practice, right? And what's really wonderful is in Black feminist theory and queer theory, the question of praxis is critical. You know, emergent strategy is a relatively new text that came out by Adrienne Marie Brown, where she speaks extensively about how pedagogical frameworks about centering change, right? Centering trust, centering conflict can be catalytic to how we engage with each other as people. And you know, one of the most popular texts, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right, is something that we as activists read to think about what does it look like to really engage with the oppressed as equals and not as people that we have to bring along with us, versus centering them in our work. And I think Qur'an of the Oppressed, the title, right, it really rings on that legacy of what does it mean to center the oppressed versus doing charity work as a way to absolve us of the political responsibility to change structures of oppression, right? And in our earlier conversation, Shadaab, you talked extensively about your personal experience and how secularism particularly, and the assumptions on Muslims Muslims, those who were deemed good Muslims versus bad Muslims, informed some of your analysis around justice, right? So can you tell me about this binary and what your thoughts around the secular tropes are right now with this good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very problematic dichotomy that has pervaded life since September 11th, 2001. So since 9/11, what Muslims say and do has been clumped into this very, very suffocating dichotomy of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim. And the good versus bad has actually nothing to do with theology, but rather has to do with one's political stances. So if I want to talk about interfaith dialogue in a politically abstracted way, which is a nice way of saying in a manifestly non-political or apolitical manner, that is something that elevates me to the level of a good Muslim, the type of Muslim that you want to have a conversation with, right? A type of Muslim whose voice should be heard. Now, if I want to challenge certain interfaith discussions by saying, well, what about the political dimensions of this whole discussion? So for example, Muslim-Jewish interfaith dialogue, that is an extremely important conversation that needs to be had. And there are fundamental scriptural similarities, especially in terms of prophetic stories and Abrahamic legacy between the Qur'an and the Torah. But in our day and age, we cannot have a genuine Muslim-Jewish dialogue without pointing out the elephant in the room, which is the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Now, if I want to say, let's talk about the politics of this situation, of this dialogue, who is framing it and to what political ends, all of a sudden I become sort of the angry Muslim, right? The bad Muslim. And we need to break through these binaries because binaries are created to suppress and suffocate. And the world is not binary. And so it's very important that we try to challenge that. And what's scary is how globalized the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic has become. We can see it in the context of South Asia with Hindu nationalist movements like the BJP deploying this type of discourse. We can see it in different parts of the world. And it's very important that we name it. And I'm not the first to name it. There are others who have done it. And Mahmoud Mamdani, who is actually in New York, a scholar of African studies at Columbia University, he has written a wonderful book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And I'm not the first to name it, but by naming it, just like by naming accommodationist theology, you're seeing what needs to be deconstructed. You're accepting, acknowledging that this is not natural, this is socially constructed, and therefore you are able to produce alternatives.
I think that really resonates with a lot of organizers, whether you're in Students for Justice in Palestine or you're a part of a mainstream Muslim organization that decides to work with, for example, the Anti-Defamation League, or that decides to, sign on. For example, Ilhan Omar is facing a lot of backlash because she signed on to a no sanctions in Iran bill right now with AIPAC. Right? And I think that it just shows the complexity of what it means to do the work in a hegemonic structure where even if you wanted to, for example, talk to the people on the other side, you have to contend with these really difficult questions on like, are we aligned when it comes to our vision of solidarity and anti-oppression, And I think it's been really hard for a lot of Muslim organizers because, the field is always looking to either cast us as too radical or we have to compromise on our beliefs when it comes to negotiating. And I'll answer this question, I'll ask this question from the audience now because it's related to this, but someone asked, what is the relationship between orthodoxy and liberation theology? Is there room within the orthodox that's not necessarily conservative and the interpretations and practices being towards liberative thinking, or are they dichotomous?
Okay, that is a great question. Without essentializing orthodoxy, and by essentializing, I mean ascribing an unchanging essence to orthodoxy as being necessarily right or necessarily conservative or necessarily anything, liberation theology is anti-orthodox. But it is not anti-orthodox for the sake of being anti-orthodox. Like, you get you know, this emergent social group where you're wearing all the cool things, you got all the cool clothes on, but you don't actually have any flesh in terms of the actual politics, right? Not trying to be a rebel for the sake of being a rebel. Liberation theology has a problem with orthodoxy, or a particular orthodoxy, because that orthodoxy is built on certain privileged experiences at the expense of other experiences. That is the fundamental problem. So to the extent that orthodoxy is exclusionary, liberation theology would try to situate itself as a corrective, and as a humble corrective, understanding that there's not one location on the margin, but there are multiple margins. And so that we really have to think in strong and bold, but also complex and nuanced ways when we try to create a genuinely inclusive society. Now, to be provocative, I'm someone who wants to change the existing reality. That's what I want to bequeath to my own children as an engaged parent, right? So for me, my ultimate goal is for liberation theology to be the new orthodoxy. I want to mainstream liberation theology. And that is why it's very important that we don't play into a secular dichotomy between Islam on the one hand and social justice, liberation, and human rights on the other. Because if we do, we lose a huge audience on this earth. And that audience is people who take faith seriously. If I want to create change in a Muslim majority context, whether in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Jordan, I need to engage religion. Progressive discourse cannot alienate religion. And so to make liberation theology a new egalitarian orthodoxy, we need to engage religious folk and people of faith in general.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things you brought up is like how important it is to reframe the way we see religion play a role in our concept of justice. You know, and I really love how deep you went in this book on the concept of divine justice. And you know, particularly for Isaac's work, for so many of us was like, you know, oh my God, I didn't even know this person existed. The South African Muslim who was working within the Muslim community to change the way that they engage with the apartheid struggle. And these stories, those are the little catalysts that we can see as like being formative to how we organize Muslim communities, right? So can you tell me a little bit about what was so cool about it? What was cool about unpacking these lessons and how you saw divine justice?
Sure. Could I just start by saying a few words about Farid Isaac?
Of course.
Okay. And then I will come to divine justice. So for those of you who don't know, because one thing I don't believe in as a liberation theologian is name dropping. There is no shame in not knowing what's going on. Knowledge is, no one is born with this knowledge, it's acquired, all right? So I want this to be as accessible as possible. Farid Isaac is an Islamic theologian from South Africa. He grew up in the Cape, and he is basically the pioneering Muslim liberation theologian. He wrote a very influential text in 1997 called Qur'an, Liberation and Pluralism, an Islamic Perspective of Interreligious Solidarity Against Oppression. And what's amazing about this book, it is basically a theological reflection of his own commitment to the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, the first time that he was arrested was at the age of 9 by the apartheid security police. And so he is engaged in this struggle as someone who lives on the edges of this apartheid society. And then as a classically trained Muslim theologian, he goes to the Qur'an and says, how can my text speak to my context? Not just the oppressive character of that context, but my struggle with my fellow comrades against the apartheid regime. And he produces this reading of the Qur'an. And talking about how context is so important, if you pick up that book, the book is about the Qur'an, right? It's what we would call thematic commentary, a commentary focusing on a certain theme, which is social justice. The first chapter of that book has nothing to do with the Qur'an. The first chapter unpacks the history of South Africa, the history of the Cape, and his own autobiographical narrative growing up on the margins of that society, as a victim, but also as a resistor of apartheid. It is from the second chapter onwards that we then engage in a deep theological reflection on the Qur'an. And that's what we mean. That's what I mean here when I say one's context of oppression, one's context of suffering is holy. And it is a text as much as the text of Scripture, because the text of Scripture will be unlocked in the most genuine sense through the text of your context. Now, sorry for that long explanation.
Do not apologize. That was
okay.
Yeah.
Going into divine justice. Divine justice is central to liberation theology because liberation theology is based on a deep-seated belief in the nature of God, that my God, right? And notice the intimacy of that, not just God, but my God, our God, right? That we claim an ownership over God, that my God is a just God. And not only is my God a just God, my God is in solidarity with the oppressed against their oppressor. And this is very important. We can't have a genuine discussion about social justice and oppression if we're not willing to take sides. To talk about the oppressed is at the same time to talk about the oppressor. And for Islamic liberation theology, this is a fundamental belief, what we would call a preferential option for the oppressed. And if you look at the Qur'an, there are various verses in which God, Allah, has this preferential option for the marginalized group. Let me give you an example. Chapter 28, verse 5. وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. That's chapter 28, verse 5. And this chapter is referring to the Israelite liberation under Pharaoh's dictatorial regime. Quote, "It is our will," here God is speaking in the royal we, "it is our will to bestow our grace upon the downtrodden of the earth, and to make them the leaders, and to make them the inheritors of the earth." So here we have a God who is in solidarity with the margins against the oppressive center. And so that preferential option for the oppressed captures a God who is not neutral. This is a God who is not neutral. When there is injustice, I will not be an observer, but I will get involved and get my hands messy and stand with the oppressed against their oppressor. So that's what we mean in liberation theology when we talk about divine justice.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that explanation reigns true for so many of us that are trying to, for example, mobilize our mosque, you know, or mobilize a community center that has stayed within the realm of charity because it's the safe thing to do, versus getting into the nitty-gritty, for example, addressing sexual violence in the Muslim community, or addressing, you know, some of the bigger dynamics of patriarchy that happen within our communities. And I think that differentiation is really a wonderful guiding point for Muslims that are looking to do organizing or looking to do work that challenges structures, right? And I think many of us, you know, if we go to ICNA, or if we go to any of the large Muslim gatherings, you know, we always want to think of like, how are we practicing divine justice, right? And somebody had asked in the chat for an example around the struggle of liberation theology. And I think this example of Farid Ezek is super poignant. You know, it really speaks to a model that challenges something as big as apartheid, right? In America, we could put the context of the white supremacist state, and how that can really inspire us to do super local trust building work while having ripple effects on structures of oppression, you know? And I really love that you hone in on how the liberation of self is tied to the liberation of others. And, you know, this has been a very popular formation for Black organizers, you know, historically. No one is free until we all get free, you know? And for Equality Labs, you know, we've been organizing South Asian communities to really confront hegemonic understandings of what it means to be South Asian. And we have seen with the rise of Hindu nationalism, Wahhabi movements as well, that have impacted a lot of South Asian minority communities, as well as those Muslims that don't fit into the Orthodox bubble. And it also means that we had to talk exclusively about caste and religious intolerance as a threat of violence in our community. Can you speak a little bit about like your chapter on India and how you looked at Ali engineer's work, and also what are the important takeaways on the points you had about the oral traditions and the importance of centering those illiterate communities, for example, in South Asia?
So Asghar Ali Engineer was a great Muslim theologian, a pioneering liberation theologian in Islam, and also a very important voice in terms of countering communal violence in the Indian context. And he passed away in 2013. May he rest in power. He played a very important role in liberation theology and also in trying to advocate for peace and justice in the Indian context. And he had a discourse on communalism that I think is very influential. And I think we need to be critical of it. As important as he is, as a scholar and also an activist, he really walked the walk. This is someone who was beaten up at various points in his life. His house was raided. This was not some academic sitting in a fancy office in an Ivy League school writing books. This is someone who was on the ground. I want to do justice to that in terms of his life. For engineer, he wrote a lot on communal violence, and he was talking about how religion is usually seen as the main culprit of communal violence between Muslim and Hindu communities. And in a nutshell, his argument was that, look, not only is religion not the problem, it is actually part of the solution. That is to say, we can use religion as a rich resource to create communal harmony between Muslim and Hindu communities, A. And B, that the real culprits of the problem were politicians and religious elites. So politicians and religious elites within both communities basically stir up their communities to attack the religious other. And I think that's problematic because it gives off the impression that these two communities are roughly equal in power and in stature. And in the Indian context, that is certainly not the case. It is not that Hindu and Muslim communities are roughly equal and they're going at each other. Communal violence in India is about a majority group, the wider Hindu community, bullying and brutalizing a minority group. And that minority group is comprised of about 200 million people, and yet they are some of the poorest Indians in the state of India. I mean, they are as poor, if not poorer, than so-called untouchables, the Dalits. So this is sort of the discourse. And I'm sorry, you weren't talking about communal violence per se, but I think that is the wider context that's important. But something that comes up is the issue of orality. And particularly in the Indian context, when one is in solidarity with Dalit communities, for example, orality is very important because we have to understand power in everything that we see. When we talk about literacy, there's a dichotomy embedded in the word literacy, and that is literacy, not versus orality, but literacy versus something that is negative, illiteracy, right? And we need to be critical. In the history of empire, literacy has been used, as complex as it is, it has been used as a colonial tool to belittle and to oppress marginalized groups. So when we talk about the voices of the marginalized, it's not just the content of their voices, but also the form that that content comes out in. How is it expressed? And for a lot of marginalized groups, oral history, oral culture, oral stories, that is very important in delivering that content. And that is something that has to be respected. I'm a Canadian, which means I come from a settler colony called Canada. A lot of you are in the United States, or perhaps there are some from Australia or New Zealand. These are all settler colonies. In the history of these colonies, literacy, the written word, was used to belittle the language, customs, and livelihood of the indigenous peoples of the land, for whom oral culture was and proudly continues to be a central part of their lived expression. So we just need to be aware of that. It's not about saying literacy is good per se and orality is bad per se, but it's an understanding that there are dichotomies involved, and dichotomies are usually power dichotomies, where it is one over the other, not one next to the other. So that was very convoluted. If anything is unclear, please write down your questions.
No, the questions we're getting are so hot that we're gonna have to cut down the questions I had for you to move into some of these wonderful questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Everybody keep chatting them in. I'm gonna spend my time with Shadaab answering them. And you know, what you said earlier really rings for us as people that are centering Dalit, Bahujan, Muslim, and Adivasi voices at Equality Labs, because, you know, traditionally Brahmanism made it so that those who were of oppressed caste communities were not allowed to learn Sanskrit. Sanskrit was something that if you as a Dalit or Bahujan person tried to learn, your ears would be burnt with lead by the Brahmin caste because you were impure and you were not allowed to learn the scripture of Hinduism. And I think it's so important to think about how this dynamic of purity, this dynamic of those who are the spiritual class and caste of the community are able to gatekeep religion and are able to hold religious definitions of what is the path towards righteousness, you know? So before we jump into some of those questions that folks had, I would love to just talk really quick about Amina Wadood's examination of work that you did, and Asma Barlas. And one of the concepts that really I want to bring out is the living your politic piece. So what does it mean to live your politic? And it's in relationship to the gender justice analysis within the book. And this is connected to a question that Fahad asked in like, what is the role of liberation theology in needing to be an oppositional force to hegemony?
Okay, so in terms, let me first say a few words about women's readings of the Qur'an. At its core, women's readings of the Qur'an is about subject position. It's about who gets to interpret it. All goes back to the who question. And the problem is that for 1400 years, men have put themselves in the interpreter seat and interpreted the text. And as a result, their lived experiences, problems, and challenges have framed our understanding of the text. Recall what I said about accommodationist theology. Because it is the powerful theology, it becomes theology with the uppercase T. So as a result of men's readings of the Qur'an, we don't actually see them as men's readings of the Qur'an. We see them as readings of the Qur'an, objective with an uppercase R. And so a big part of women's readings of the Qur'an is not saying that 1400 years of reflection doesn't matter, all right? It does matter, but it's about saying half of humanity matters as well, and that women need to enter the interpretive circle and to bring their own lived experiences, challenges, concerns, and problems to the understanding of the text. So that's what women's readings of the Qur'an is in a nutshell. It's not about well-meaning, even progressive men now interpreting the Qur'an with an eye to women's rights, because the interpreter, that seat hasn't changed. It's still about men. It's just progressive instead of patriarchal now. It's about women entering that circle and undertaking interpretation of the text. And these two scholars, the African-American Amina Wadood and the Pakistani-American Asma Barlas, are pioneering figures in this field. And they talk about different elements of women's rights in the Qur'an. And something that Amina Wadood brings up that I find really powerful is this idea of not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, right? Living out your politics. And I had the opportunity to interview all of these scholars, Farid Isaq, Asghar the engineer, Amina Wadood, and Asma Barlas. And when I interviewed Amina Wadood, she talked to me about the importance of not simply writing, right? It goes back to praxis, but living out that writing in your actual day-to-day praxis. And when it comes to gender, the family, the private sphere becomes a very important place to live out that practice, to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk. So if we're going to talk about egalitarian readings of the Qur'an at a podium in an academic conference or on a webinar, what that means is that that discourse has to be coupled with a practice of egalitarianism in the home, all right? So what that means is that men need to value the housework that women have historically in patriarchal contexts have to do, and to partake in that housework, and to partake in childcare, and to take pride in it as work for Allah, as much as work outside the home is also work for Allah. Okay, and I think that's very important. It's not simply about women also going out into the public space, because sometimes this becomes a very tricky double bind where women are going out into the public space working, but then they come home after a full day's work and do all of the housework again because the men are too good to do it, right? When we talk about going out, women going out into the public space, we're also talking about men re-entering the private space with a new masculinity that is committed to liberation, not only in talk, but liberation in one's actual lifestyle in the home context. And so that, I think, is very important. Many of us are homeschooling now, right? Just speaking as a fellow parent to potential parents who are listeners as well. Many of us are homeschooling. For me, that is part of Islamic practice. For the men in the audience, that as men, as male parents, that you also participate in that, because that's been one of the patriarchal consequences of being locked up at home, where women are still undertaking all of the labor. And men are not participating in that labor. And what I want you to get out of this is that that's not just a social discussion, it's a theological discussion, because a meaningful discussion of theology is a social conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And for many of our like queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks, like they don't even appear in the normative discourse around like gender roles and what it means to practice liberation when it comes to like gender liberation or LGBTQ liberation. So one of the questions that we got, and a few people asked this, is about, you know, there are controversial and disputed verses, right? And some are homophobic, some are interpreted as, you know, being okay to hit women, you know? So what are some of the ways that you can discuss this? And I wanted to prelude this answer by saying Shadaab's book actually details some of the ways that we can unpack these verses, as well as the bibliography having tons of folks who have done even more critical readings of Lut, for example, the story of Lut, and other verses that are seen as controversial. And I'll just add another question to this so you can answer it together. Is, you know, there's also this, as you know, this huge co-optation, Shadaab. All of these like imams, cis men, are now also using, right, progressive discourse as a way to position themselves as this awesome anti-patriarchal, anti-racist imam or spiritual scholar. And, you know, we saw that with Yasser Qadi. He held a huge LGBTQ conference 2 months ago that had no queer voices and was basically continuing the discourse of saying we shouldn't kill LGBTQ people, but like, you know, they're okay, and that in the eyes of God, we should forgive them for their sins, right? So this discourse is also super normal for us to see. So just, can you talk after answering the question about the disputed verses, because we're not actually getting into theology on this call, but we do want to talk about the co-optation of progressive rhetoric and liberation theology.
Okay, this is a really great question, and it's really rich. So if you don't mind, I'm going to break it up into 3 parts and then just engage them one by one. So I saw 3 themes pop out: domestic violence, homosexuality and queer experience, and the politics of being an ally. So let me begin with the politics of being an ally. And here I've learned a lot from Amina Wadud, and also from that great human being behind you on the bookshelf, Brother Malcolm X. For those of you who haven't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it is the greatest text that you will ever read. It completely changed my life. I highly recommend you do it. There is an incredible scene where Malcolm is sitting in a Nation of Islam office in Harlem, and a white student from a liberal arts college in Boston goes up to him, and she's quite well-meaning, and she's like, look, I want to participate in the Black anti-white supremacist struggle. Can I join the Nation of Islam? And he says no. Now, in the movie, that's the adaptation that Spike Lee does, it sort of ends there. The story sort of ends there. He's like, no, you can't be a part of this. But the biography is actually more nuanced. In the biography, he says, you have a role to play, but it's not speaking to us. It's not telling us what to do. Your role as a white person is very important, and that role is to speak to fellow white people, because that is where racism in America lies, among white folk, not among people of color and African Americans in particular. So there was a role, and it was about what? Calling out the complicity of people in your own community who are complicit in the suffering of others, right? And we can see bell hooks talk about this. Black feminists have been at the forefront of saying we cannot be man-hating. Why? Because white feminists had the privilege of being man-hating because their families were not under attack. The history of slavery is what? It is a history of attacking the Black family. And the family was important. The family was not a locus of oppression. The family was a space for protection from white racism. Okay? So bell hooks says that men have a role to play, but they need to understand what that role is. That role is to speak to the sexism of fellow men, all right? So the way I see it is that as a progressive male, if I can try to frame myself as such, right? Because it's something that you try every single day. It's not something that you say, it's something that you do. The goal is to call out the complicity of fellow men and to get men to understand their subjectivity and their lived experiences of privilege, and what voices have been silenced as a result of that. It's not about guilt. It's about social justice, right? So what is the role that can be played? So I think that's very important in the politics of allyship, right? On how to be a committed and strong, but also sensitive and reflective ally. Let's talk about domestic violence. So there is a verse in the Qur'an that is misrepresented as the wife-beating verse, and that is chapter 4, verse 34. So Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 34. And the very end of it, there's a statement that says, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, and beat them. And this last part is usually interpreted, again, who, right? The who question, by male interpreters as giving license to men to physically discipline disobedient wives. Now, to be sure, this is after a series of other measures, separate in the bedroom and do this and do that. But at the end, or wadribuhunna, and beat them. Now, women's interpreters go up to the text and they say, okay, it says wadribuhunna, and the verb is daraba. Let's understand the Qur'an. Let's understand a certain term or word by looking at how that term or word is used in the rest of the text. So if God is one, and the Qur'an is God's word, let's approach the Qur'an as unified as well. They look at how daraba is used in other parts of the text, and they see that it has different meanings. So for example, Alam tara kayfa daraba Allahu mathalan. Do you not see how God strikes examples? So here striking is something that is figurative, to strike an example. Now, women's readers are not saying that Muslim men for 1400 years have misunderstood this verse. This is the wrong understanding and their understanding is the right one. What they're saying is, what is the gendered politics of interpretation? When we have a spectrum of different meanings, daraba can also mean to leave a home, to cross a desert. When we have a spectrum of meanings, why is it that one meaning that works to the detriment of women's health and bodies, why is that meaning elevated over other meanings that could actually be much more egalitarian? So that's what it means to enter the interpretive seat and to interpret the text in the light of your own subjectivity, lived experiences. Homosexuality. Now, I'm not a scholar in this area in terms of homosexuality in the Quran. I would recommend that you look at the work of Scott Kugel, who has written extensively on homosexuality in Islam. So he wrote a wonderful book in 2010 called Homosexuality in Islam, Critical Reflection on Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Muslims. He has a chapter, I believe it's chapter 2, that looks at the Quran. And I think it's a very powerful chapter because in the chapter, he shows that a lot of assumptions that we bring to the Quran are shaped by biblical baggage. And it's very important that we understand that. And that's not something that is contemporary. In the history of Islam, interpretation of the Quran, unfortunately, was understood biblically. So the mufassirun, the commentators, would draw on Isra'iliyat, literally Israelite literature, biblical literature, to interpret the text, all right? And in the Old Testament, the position on homosexuality is categoric and sweeping, that this is something that is, quote unquote, evil. Right? That this is something that led to the destruction of the peoples of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Kugel shows that in the Quran, there is no explicit condemnation of homosexuality. And he argues very persuasively that the crime of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah was one of rape and highway robbery, not one of consensual homosexual relations. It was rape and highway robbery. I highly recommend that you read that chapter. Again, what does this show? It shows that while there is one Quran, there is a battle over the interpretations of the Quran. Now, I noticed just from looking at the comments very quickly, I noticed that there was one question that said, well, if you can interpret the Quran in different ways, how will you not have billions of different interpretations? There is a spectrum of interpretations, but the text can allow us to only go so far. What liberation theology is saying is that the text allows us to go much further than we think. A lot of women's readings of the Quran is about saying, what exactly does the Quran have to say? So for example, and Shabin, if I'm going off, feel free to jump in. For example, polygamy, all right? Do I need to stretch the text to make a principal stance against polygamy? Women's readers are like, let's see what exactly the text has to say. So chapter 4, verse 3, the so-called polygamy verse. For a lot of conservative Muslims, not just only conservative men, but also conservative women, this is a scriptural license for polygamy in Islam. women's readers say, what does the text itself say? وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّن نِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً. If you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphans, then marry women that you like, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with them, then only one. What we can see here is that there is a clear historical context that has shaped the revelation of this verse, and that context has to do with a situation that is not normal. It is an extenuating circumstance that has to do with a surplus of orphans. Now, we don't just have feminist interpreters of the Qur'an, we have feminist historians of Islam. So female historians have gone into the text and shown that this verse was revealed after the Battle of Uhud, in which the Muslims lost. A lot of Muslim men were killed, and there was a surplus of orphans. So this text was revealed in an extenuating circumstance, trying to engage a particular circumstance, and it was not for all times and all places. So the historical context is very important, and so is the language of the text, an overwhelming emphasis on social justice. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. If you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphans. And then at the end of that, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً. But if you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with them, then only one. So justice is a condition of polygamy, even in this extenuating circumstance. And then later in the chapter 4, verse 129, the Qur'an says this, وَلَن تَسْتَطِيعُوا أَن تَعْدِلُوا بَيْنَ النِّسَاءِ وَلَوْ حَرَصْتُمْ. And you will not be able to treat your wives with justice, even if you are eager to do so. Chapter 4, verse 129. So on the one hand, the Quran sets up justice as a requirement for polygamy. And then it says you actually can't even do that.
You can't even do that.
You can't even do that. And what women's interpreters are saying, social context matters. Experiences of oppression are holy. They matter. So if social research, see, Islamic studies is not just about theologians, it's also about psychiatrists, counselors, right? If social researchers are showing that women in context of polygamy have severely, manifestly unjust experiences, and if justice is one of the requirements of the text, then clearly polygamy cannot be carried out in the name of Islam. It would not be applicable to our world, right? So this is what it means. It's not about saying anything can be Islamic. There is a spectrum, but all spectrums get pushed to boundaries, and women's interpreters are like, let's just see what the text itself has to say.
Right. And then the concept of divine justice being central to even how we look at the response and the engagement with some of these critical questions. We have time for about 2 more questions. And we have a lot of Muslims that are now engaging with prison abolition. They're engaging with questioning carcerality. They're engaging with what it means to really challenge a state that incarcerates people and over punishes. So some people are asking, what are your thoughts about prison abolition and Islam, and how to use some of our liberatory understandings of how justice can be served and brought through prison abolition and restorative justice?
That's a great question. I don't know enough about the subject to answer that question in an authoritative way, but I will say this in response to the question. By the way, I'd flagged this up to Sharmeen earlier. I like to be very clear when I don't know how to answer a question, because I think that's a big part of being someone who genuinely wants to learn, that when I don't know, I'll say I don't know. But I will say this, a big part of the message of liberation theology, Islamic, Christian, or otherwise, is to challenge people to think institutionally, to challenge people to think structurally, all right? Individuals matter, but none of us exist in vacuums. We are all parts of communities. We are all social. We are all communal, whether we like it or not. And a big part of oppression is about oppressing groups through the creation of structures, through the creation of institutions that then take on an aura of neutrality, but are in fact disproportionately oppressing certain groups over other groups. And I can't think of a better example of that than the prison system in general, but particularly in the United States, in which African Americans have overwhelmingly faced the brunt of incarceration, right? So this is what it means to talk about liberation, not simply liberation of the self, but if we say my liberation is connected to the liberation of the other, it's about saying, I will think about the world around me, which includes religion, not in an individual way, but in a social way. And I think that's very, very important. One more point. I'm seeing that picture of Malcolm X, two of them in the back of your room. From a historical perspective, liberation theology in an American context emerged through the African American community, and it is deeply indebted to the legacy of the Nation of Islam. So when we talk about Islamic liberation theology in the context of the United States, we're talking about theology done in the context of the prison system, right? That is where Malcolm met Elijah Muhammad. And now it's been very cool for mainstream Sunni Muslims. I even say this as a fellow Sushi to say, oh yeah, but the Nation of Islam, they weren't real Islam. But then Malcolm understood real Islam after his Hajj experience. And I would argue that in terms of its praxis, all right, maybe the dogma is a different discussion. But for me, religion is not just about dogma, it's about praxis. In terms of its praxis, in terms of its commitment to speaking truth to power and siding with the oppressed, I can't think of a more Islamic American historical organization than the Nation of Islam, A. And B, I actually believe that Malcolm X became more radicalized after the Hajj because he began to make global connections between African American suffering and empire in general. That was a shift in his thinking, where he was like, this is no longer a civil rights issue as framed by Dr. King. This is a human rights issue. And so he was thinking globally. And this is when the CIA became really fearful of Malcolm X and his potential, because now he was an international actor. And in his ability to shake up the status quo more, I would argue that he became even more radical. So when we talk about liberation theology and we talk about incarceration and prison systems, Islam emerged in the American context, in a liberative context, in the prison incarcerated system.
Absolutely. And some people have asked, like, how do we center the sects and factions of Islam that are the minorities? And does liberation theology center them? And I answered in the chat, absolutely, that we need to be able to see their experiences of whether it be communal oppression or silencing or repression from the state as examples of how we need to be able to center minorities in our understanding of Islam. And I think the arguments that people love to get in, which is like theological arguments of what is the truth, actually take us away from the important work of coming to an analysis of what does freedom look like for all of us, and what does it look like to create a united front against imperialism, against nationalisms of all kinds, and anti-Black racism within our communities. I also wanted to uplift Believers Bailout, which is a super important coalition that has formed to support Muslims who are incarcerated and doing critical political education for Muslims to understand what prison abolition looks like for our communities. So Believers Bailout has been hosting a lot of education sessions as well as digital fundraisers, and I really recommend you guys all follow them. Shadaab, I feel like we have about a couple of minutes. I just want to hear, like, do you have any closing remarks, anything that you want to point people towards? A lot of people are asking, where can I learn more? Have no fear. We're creating an Islamic liberation theology reading list. Equality Labs, Equality Labs has a very big commitment to research, so you can just go to our webpage where we conglomerate all of our resources. And once again, Shadaab's bibliography points you to 100 other texts that you should read. But I would love to hear any closing remarks. And somebody actually asked, did you get any pushback from this book? Did anybody come for you, or did you feel, because you were challenging orthodoxy, did you have any experiences that you were like challenged by? Because I know anybody who speaks against orthodoxy is just at the brunt of critique in our community. So yeah, that and any closing.
That's a great question. Thus far, I haven't had pushback. And I think one of the reasons is that there is a silent majority in this world that is looking for a liberative mode of expression. But there are minorities, not in a good sense, there are privileged minorities that are very loud in propagating an exclusionary discourse. And here, of course, the Wahhabi movement has been central in propagating a very non-tolerant form of Islam, particularly towards Shias and towards Sufi Muslims. And I feel that there is a majority that wants to hear that message, because based on their own lived experiences, that message makes sense to them. When we talk about oppression, what is it? It is the challenge to think from the perspective of the majority. And that is not the same as being majoritarian. The challenge is to think from the perspective of the majority, because the majority of people in this world are marginalized. The privileged are, in fact, a few. Forgive me, what was the question there? Pushback, sorry. So
yeah.
I'm happy to say that I haven't experienced any pushback thus far. But of course, that might also be, I mean, in terms of the gender aspects of my book, that might also be because of my own privileged subject position as a man. If I was a Muslim woman without a hijab, for example, writing this without schooling in a traditional Islamic seminary, surely there would be a different reception to my work. So when I talk about being reflective of one's own subject position, it's something that I also have to be myself as a thinker and as an activist, and to always think, well, where am I as a member of a community marginalized, but also where am I privileged? And so I also think that is a part of the pushback, that my privileged status as a man created less pushback than had I been a woman. Had I been a woman. So I think that could be one element of it. But again, I do think there's a silent majority that wants that liberative language to line up with their own experiences. To close off, here's a message that I would give to social movements, since this is a social movement venue. Liberation theology is all about raising the who question, right? Who is, the fancy academic term is interlocutor, right? Don't even try to spell that, just conversation partner, dialogue partner, all right? Liberation theology, who is the dialogue partner of my theology? And liberation theology is saying our dialogue partner, our theology cannot be produced anymore for the interests and needs and desires of the center. It has to be produced for the needs of the margins, of the forgotten and neglected edges of society. I challenge you to think about that in terms of social movements. Who are, genuinely and transparently asking the question, who are the dialogue partners of our particular social movement? Our priorities, our objectives, our mission statement, to whose interest do they work towards, and to whose interest do they work against? And one more thing to think about, in agitating, in militating against injustice, it is crucial in liberation theology to think about the root causes of oppression, right? Not just the symptoms of oppression, but moving beyond the surface and actually thinking about, well, what are the root causes, the systemic roots of a given situation? And my advice as a fellow liberation theologian to fellow social activists is to constantly think about the root causes of oppression, because if we want a practice that is genuinely transformative, it is the root causes that we have to engage and not simply the symptoms on the surface.
Yeah, and I think that that answers the question around restorative justice and working towards like a different way of being. You know, I think so much of domination has cut our ability to think about the visionary aspects of how we organize outside of hegemony. And I really appreciate you asking these poignant questions. And I really wanted to usher people to reading as a starting point to look at these questions. You know, I don't see our role as being spiritual gatekeepers for people to engage with these questions. We actually want a co-liberatory movement where all of us are working towards our freedom together and able to ask these critical questions because of the intersectionality, but also the layers of oppression we all exist in. So I wanted to thank Shadaab, and I wanted to share that all of our money today that we're raising is going towards the Queer Muslim Project. So they are one of the leading storytellers and organizers within South Asia and the diaspora to document queer Muslim history. You can follow them on Instagram at Queer Muslim Project, and all of your donations will go towards them and protecting their livelihoods in such a difficult moment. You could Venmo at Equality Labs, or you could visit our website and make a donation and be sure to clarify that this is towards the Queer Muslim Project. I am available for any questions. If folks want access to that reading list, we will be emailing it out in the next couple of days. Shadaab is somebody who's opened up a lot of critical questions, so let us know if you have any deeper questions, but we're really grateful for this conversation and hope everybody has a good Ramadan and that we continue working towards freedom.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Sharmeen, and thank you to all who listened to this. I wish you a happy Ramadan. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write to Sharmeen or also to myself. I'll give Sharmeen my email address. And I would love to point you to more sources. I would like to see this as the beginning, as an invitation to engage faith in a progressive way, and not just a conversation that begins and ends, but that continues.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.